Welcome to Insight Lens, where global power struggles are stripped bare and the truth hits harder than any headline. The European Union has just unleashed its 18th package of sanctions against Russia, and this is where it strikes at the very heart of Moscow's war machine. They called it decisive, even historic. In Brussels, Commission President Wolfgang breathed with confidence, proclaiming that Europe had finally delivered a direct blow to Russia's defense industry and economy. With almost childlike optimism, she even teased that the 19th package was already in the making. But beneath the headlines, the story takes a darker, almost absurd turn. 17 sanctions before have already come and gone, and Russia's economy and military remain far from a collapse. And that's exactly where Moscow's counter-narrative strikes back. Dmitry Medvedev, used president, now Kremlin's most infamous firebrand, ridiculed Brussels in a torrent of bitter sarcasm. In his words, von der Leyen hadn't struck at Russia's heart at all. Instead, she had only exposed Europe's ignorance, its arrogance, and its failure to understand the very adversary it claimed to weaken. This wasn't just politics, it was psychological warfare sharpened with ridicule. Medvedev's attacks weren't only aimed at a leader, but at the very symbols of European power and moral authority. And that's how Europe's proud announcement turned almost instantly into Russia's most effective weapon, not on the battlefield, but in the war of words.
Europe thought it was waging an economic war, but Medvedev turned it into a war of humiliation. Dmitry Medvedev's reaction was not a calm rebuttal, it was a calculated storm of mockery. He ridiculed Ursula von der Leyen, sneering at her past as a failed doctor and suggesting she had no idea what the heart of Russia even meant. His aim was clear, not only to undermine her authority, but to strip her of dignity, turning the head of the European Commission into a punchline. He dug deep in her biography, reminding the world that she had once been a gynecologist accused of professional incompetence, later criticized as Germany's weakest defense minister. Now, as Europe's top leader, she was portrayed as blind to strategy and history. By weaving together past failures with her present role, Medvedev struck a blow that blurred the line between political insult and personal annihilation. And he didn't stop there. One by one, he turned to the nations of Europe, attaching labels that echoed like curses. The Baltic states were pitiful, Finland arrogant for abandoning neutrality, Poland immature and hot-headed. Each insult was tied to painful history, a reminder of weakness, betrayal, or shame. It was brutal, but it was no accident. Medvedev's language functioned like a mirror, reflecting Europe's darkest memories back at them. From Nazi Germany to Vichy France, from Brexit Britain to Napoleon's defeat, he transformed humiliation into a strategic weapon. In the end, his tirade wasn't just about Ursula, but it was about redefining Europe itself as a fragile empire of hypocrisy.
When history becomes a weapon, yesterday's shame is used to wound today's pride. Medvedev reserved his sharpest barbs for Europe's heavyweight. The United Kingdom was branded unclean, a jab at Brexit's bitter legacy and London's role as a self-proclaimed global policeman meddling in Ukraine from the sidelines. Germany and France fared no better. For Berlin, he invoked the specter of Nazi Germany, the darkest stain on modern Europe. For France, he resurrected the humiliation of the Vichy regime, portraying both nations as morally bankrupt, forever chained to their ugliest passes. His insults were not random. They were meant to remind Europeans of the ghosts they prefer to forget. Every word tied back to betrayal, collapse, or hypocrisy. Britain's fractured identity, Germany's fascist nightmare, France's collaboration is the same, all reemerged, not as lessons of history, but as weapons of ridicule. Yet there was another layer. By tearing down Europe, Medvedev elevated Russia. He painted his country as a fortress besieged, a nation perpetually surrounded by enemies, yet undefeated.
He reminded his audience of Napoleon's failed invasion, of Hitler's catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad and on the fields of Werning. For Russians, these references were not abstract history, they were proof of survival, proof of greatness. And Medvedev was telling, Europe was weak because of his history. Russia was strong because of it. The same past that haunted Europe was recast as Russia's badge of honor. Thus, humiliation of the West became inspiration for the East, turning shame into a rallying cry for Russian resilience.
Europe's 18th sanction package promised to be the decisive strike, but its fine print tells another story. The first pillar targeted energy. Brussels imposed a new price cap on Russian oil at roughly $47 per barrel, with reviews every 6 months. It banned imports of refined products made from Russian crude, even if processed in third countries, and blacklisted 105 tankers accused of helping Moscow's shadow fleet. With those additions, more than 400 vessels are now barred from European ports. And to seal the blow, the EU confirmed the Nord Stream pipelines would remain frozen, their future permanently shut. The second pillar was financial. 22 additional Russian banks were added to the blacklist, facing outright bans on transactions. The measures extended beyond Russia to Belarus, signaling that any state facilitating Moscow's war effort would share the cost. The third pillar was technology and defense. 26 organizations accused of supplying Russia's military were sanctioned. Brussels tightened export bans on dual-use goods, from precision CNC machines to advanced chemicals for missile fuel. The message was clear: choke off Russia's ability to rebuild or modernize its war machine. On paper, this was a sweeping package. Energy flows cut, banks isolated, military technology restricted. To Europe, it looked like a strike at the core of Russia's economy and armed forces. To Ursula von der Leyen, it was proof that Europe still had leverage and unity. But behind the grand declarations, a different question loomed. Who would truly pay the higher price, Russia or Europe itself?
Sanctions meant to cripple Moscow are instead shaking the foundations of Europe itself. The energy war tells the clearest story. While Brussels boasts of cutting off Russian crude, the reality is more complicated. Nations like Germany, France, and Spain quietly buy Russian oil through intermediaries at higher prices and greater risk. Meanwhile, Moscow redirects flows eastward, selling to China, India, and the Middle East, often at a premium. Instead of starving the Kremlin, Europe's embargo has fueled price volatility and left its own industry scrabbling for stability. Finances follow the same paradox. Cutting 22 banks from global transactions might sound decisive, but Russia has already adapted. It built alternative payment systems, tightened partnerships with China and India, and expanded trade at rubles, yuan at rupees. Each new sanction only deepens the world's suspicion of the euro and the dollar as neutral currencies, undermining the very trust Europe depends on. Technology tells another painful tale. Brussels imagines that denying exports of CNC machines or aerospace materials will paralyze Russia's defense industry. Yet Russia has quietly replaced European suppliers for thoughtness in Iran, North Korea, and above all, China. The great effect has been on European manufacturers themselves, firms already facing shrinking orders, labor shortages, and the threat of a recession. Step by step, the sanction machine has become a boomerang. Designed to weaken Russia, it has cracked Europe's own markets, raised energy bills, and eroded trust in Western finance. What was meant as a weapon against Moscow is now cutting deepest into Europe's own flesh.
While Europe repeats old strategies, Russia is quietly rewriting the rules of the global game. 2 years of sanctions have not broken Russia, they have forced it to adapt. Instead of collapse, Moscow has restructured trade toward China, India, the Middle East, and Africa. Energy pipelines once pointed west now flow east. Russian crude fills Asian refineries, while discounted gas cements long-term deals with Beijing. Far from isolation, Russia has carved out new lifelines across Eurasia.
The same shift is happening in finance. Cut off from SWIFT, Moscow built its own payment systems and linked them to China's CIPS network. Transactions in rubles and yuan have surged, while the dollar and euro lose ground in Russia's trade portfolio. Within BRICS, discussions of a new shared currency have accelerated, a move designed to chip away at Western monetary dominance. Technology, too, has been rerouted. Where Europe closed its doors, Iran, North Korea, and especially China opened theirs. Russia might not match Western sophistication, but it has secured enough supply to sustain its war effort and industry. Each workaround is a signal. Sanctions are not stopping Moscow, only driving it further from the West. Meanwhile, Brussels cling to its sanction reflex, treating each new package as a ritual rather than strategy. The logic is linear, rigid, and disconnected from results. 17 failed rounds did not break Russia, yet the 18th was rolled out with the same expectation. And so while Europe repeats old strategies, Russia has turned punishment into transformation, emerging less defended on the West and more emboldened against it.
In the end, sanctions became less about punishing Russia and more about exposing Europe's own blind spots. Dmitry Medvedev's tirade, however vulgar, hit at a painful truth. 17 sanction packages had already failed to alter the course of war. The 18th, despite bold claims, risked repeating the same mistake. And so he labeled European leaders not as strategists, but as fools, trapped in a cycle of self-deception. For Russia, this narrative is powerful. It tells citizens their nation is not a pariah, but a survivor, that every insult from Europe only proves Russia's uniqueness, its resilience, its destiny to stand apart from the hypocritical West. Historical wounds, Napoleon, Hitler, the Cold War are invoked not as traumas, but as proof that Russia thrives under siege. For Europe, the picture is darker. Energy markets destabilized, industries weakened, trust in its financial system eroded. Each sanction meant to isolate Moscow has chipped away at Europe's own stability. The gap between rhetoric and reality has never been wider. And so the question lingers, who is truly trapped? Russia, reshaping global alliances and building new systems of survival? Or Europe, bound by its ritual of sanctions, unable to admit its strategy has backfired? In this battle of words and wills, Europe's sanctions may yet prove to be its own punishment. And that, more than Moscow's defiance, is the harshest verdict of all. Case closed. The sanctions war is Europe's wound, not Russia's.